Has someone ever taken credit for your work in the family?
It was supposed to be a casual dinner, or at least that's how it was pitched, nothing fancy, just close family, home-cooked food, and a few sentimental toasts in honor of Mom's 68th. I wasn't in the mood for sentiment, but I came. I always come, whether I want to or not. That's what I do. Show up, hold my tongue, smile like it doesn't sting when she calls Jessica my rock, or tells people I live such a busy life. Poor thing. I parked 3 blocks away because Jessica's husband had turned the driveway into a Honda graveyard, then trudged through the July heat in heels that looked better than they felt, carrying the only store-bought dish on the table, which of course earned me a passing joke about how I still hate the kitchen. I do. I hate her kitchen. And I hate the way everything in that house smells like lemon pledge and guilt. Mom had done her usual job of making the place look ready for better homes and gardens, plastic slipcovers on the good chairs, napkins folded like swans, candles she never lights unless there's company. She wore a baby pink blouse and a brooch shaped like a dove, which she clutched dramatically every time someone complimented her banana cream pie. Jessica and her husband, Todd, were already seated with their kids, who were half bored, half glued to their phones. My seat, as always, was at the end of the table, not quite next to anyone, not quite part of the inner circle. It used to bother me. These days, it just confirms what I've always known. My place in this family is whatever's left after Jessica's taken hers. Dinner was a blur of forced laughs, safe topics, and the usual round of Jessica reciting the kids' achievements as if reading off a resume. Todd chuckled on cue and dropped dad jokes like confetti, and Mom listened with her chin in her hand, glowing like Jessica had personally cured cancer. When she finally tapped her glass with a spoon, the universal signal that the evening was about to shift from annoying to unbearable, I reached for my wine, sensing danger. I was right. She stood, a little shaky but clearly rehearsed, and began thanking everyone for being there, for the love, for the years of memories, for the second chance at life she'd been given after Dad died. The kind of speech that always ends in someone crying and someone else promising to call more. Then, with that signature half-smile she saves for delivering blows wrapped in lace, she looked straight at me and said, "I want to share something important tonight, something I've been thinking about a lot lately. It's about the house and what happens to it when I'm gone." Silence. Jessica blinked. Todd smiled like a dumbass, not quite following. I took another sip of wine and stared at my plate. I already knew what was coming. She'd been dangling that house over our heads for decades, not just any house, but this house, the one she and Dad bought in '78, the one she re-wallpapered every 3 years like clockwork, the one she once called her entire life's work. She cleared her throat and continued. "I've decided that the house, everything really will go to Jessica. She's the one who visits. She's the one who shows up. And she's raising a family, which this house was built for. It just makes sense." The room didn't gasp, didn't flinch. Maybe they were too stunned, or maybe they all already knew. Maybe I was the only one surprised that she'd do it in front of everyone. No, scratch that, I wasn't surprised. I was just finally tired. Tired of pretending like any of this ever felt fair. I felt something sharp and warm bloom in my chest, not quite rage, not quite sadness, but something old and hungry. I lifted my glass slowly, held it in the air just long enough for every eye to land on me, then smiled, not the fake one I usually wear, but something sharper, and said, "Cheers to that." And cheers to me, by the way. I just bought the house on Crestwood Lane. It took a second. You could feel the confusion rolling through the room like slow thunder. Jessica tilted her head like a curious dog. Todd squinted. Mom blinked once, twice, and then her smile, that smug little badge she wears like armor, flickered. "What house?" she asked, the corners of her mouth twitching as if she already knew the answer and hated it. "You know the one," I said, keeping my tone as even as hers had been moments before. "The big white colonial you always said was your dream house? The one with the wraparound porch and the stupid blue shutters?" "Yeah, that one." Silence again, thicker this time. The kind that swallows breath. I watched her eyes dart, watched her brain try to reconcile what I was saying with the tidy version of reality she'd built in her head, where Jessica gets everything and I get nothing because I never settled down or never gave her grandkids or always had something else going on. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked at Jessica, who stared back, helpless for once. I took a slow sip of wine and said, "I close next week." Thought it'd be nice to finally live somewhere I actually wanted. That did it. The smile disappeared like a light switch flipped. Her lips pressed into a line, her shoulders stiffened, and for the first time in my life, I saw my mother not as the powerful matriarch who controlled every room she walked into, but as a small, startled woman who'd just been outplayed by the daughter she thought had no fight left. And here's the kicker. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. I didn't buy that house to win a point in some petty family fight. I'd been planning this for months, long before she ever thought to cut me out, long before she ever imagined I'd be sitting at this table calmly taking back what she never even tried to give me. Because here's the truth no one at that table knew yet, this was just the first move. And I hadn't even played my ace. There's something exhausting about constantly being the one who absorbs, who adapts, who smiles through a clenched jaw just to keep the peace, and for most of my life, that was the role I was assigned without ever really having a say in it, while Jessica, my younger sister by 3 years and somehow perpetually stuck in everyone's mind as the baby, floated through the family like a golden balloon that no one dared to let go of, all compliments and soft landings, never scolded, never questioned. Just endlessly adored. I used to think I was imagining it, that maybe I was being dramatic, maybe I was the problem, until I started collecting the memories, tucking them away like receipts I couldn't throw out, little proof slips from a lifetime of being made to feel less than. There was the time in 3rd grade when I came home sobbing because a girl in my class told me I was ugly, and instead of a hug or some motherly reassurance, Mom said, "Well, maybe don't wear those weird colors next time." That same week, Jessica got a new dress, just because, and a matching set of barrettes with little daisies on them, because, in Mom's words, she looks like a doll when she smiles. I remember my high school graduation day, the afternoon I stood in my gown, waiting for Mom to arrive so we could take pictures in the garden before the ceremony, and she showed up 40 minutes late with Jessica in tow, talking about how they'd gotten caught up at the mall, and then had the nerve to ask me if I really needed to walk across the stage or if I could just pick up my diploma the next day, because traffic was going to be a nightmare. She said it so casually, like missing the culmination of 4 years of my work would have been no different than skipping a dentist appointment. And then, of course, there was college, my acceptance letter to Northwestern, an actual dream I'd been too scared to say out loud most days, arrived the same day Jessica sprained her ankle at cheer practice. And while I sat at the dinner table holding the envelope in both hands like it was made of glass, Mom was in the living room icing Jessica's leg and cooing about how proud she was of her spirit and resilience. I ended up telling Dad instead, and we celebrated with gas station donuts in the car, him quietly saying, "I'm proud of you, Rach," while I tried not to cry into a chocolate-frosted glaze. After Dad died, the only person who had ever really balanced the scales, however imperfectly, the dynamic in the house shifted so hard it nearly buckled. Jessica became the emotional sun around which everything else orbited. And I was reduced to a name in the group text, the doing fine daughter who didn't need checking in on because, well, you've always been the independent one. That's what Mom said during one of our rare solo phone calls, where she asked how my divorce was going but only long enough to pivot to how Jessica's youngest had just said his first full sentence, which, by the way, was apparently "Mama." As if that somehow required a 3-minute standing ovation. What no one knew, not Jessica, not Mom, not even my ex, was that I'd found out about the inheritance a full 8 months before that dinner. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't whispered to me by some guilt-ridden cousin or unearthed in a forgotten document. No, it was deliberate. I'd asked. After yet another visit where Jessica showed up with a Pinterest-style charcuterie board, and I brought a bottle of wine that Mom side-eyed because it wasn't her preferred brand, I'd finally asked her directly, In the kitchen while she dried dishes she never let me wash. What happens to the house when you're gone? She didn't hesitate. She didn't lie. She said, with a kind of matter-of-fact shrug that twisted something in my gut, well, it'll go to Jessica. I mean, she's here. She loves this place. That was it. No mention of fairness, no conversation about splitting things or honoring Dad's wishes, no suggestion that I had ever done anything worthy of consideration. That's when something cracked, not the kind of break that explodes, but the quiet kind, the slow, splintering shift of a foundation that's been under pressure for too long. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just nodded, smiled like I was fine, and went home. And that night, I started making calls. Not emotional calls, not to friends or therapists or anyone who might tell me to be the bigger person, but to a real estate agent I trusted, a ruthless woman named Darlene who could sniff out property deals like a bloodhound. I told her what I wanted, a house on Crestwood Lane. Not just any house. That house. The one Mom always talked about, the one she used to drive past with a wistful sigh and say, now that's a home with bones. She wanted it for years, but Dad wouldn't budge on the price, and by the time he passed, she couldn't afford it. But I could. And I would. Darlene called me 3 months later and said it was finally for sale. The owners were moving to Oregon, downsizing. I offered full asking within 48 hours and sweetened the pot by waiving inspection. I didn't need to know if the pipes squeaked or the roof leaked, I just needed the deed. I closed under an LLC so no one could trace it back to me, and I began the renovation within the week. Every choice I made was deliberate. The wallpaper in the foyer was the same pattern Mom once tore from a magazine and taped to her fridge. The kitchen backsplash was the blue she always said felt like the ocean. Every tile, every fixture, every doorknob was a quiet retribution, a love letter turned inside out, and as the walls went up, so did my confidence. I wasn't just buying a house. I was reclaiming something I didn't even know I'd lost, power. And when I stood there at that birthday dinner, and she delivered her little announcement with all the grace of a queen bestowing a title on her favorite child, I knew something she didn't, that she could give Jessica the house I grew up in. The house where I never quite belonged, and I would be just fine. Because I'd already built a better one. And I wasn't planning to keep it to myself. But that reveal, what I did with it, well, that was still to come. The first time I saw the house on Crestwood Lane, I was 12, sitting in the back seat of Dad's old Lincoln as he drove us home from a weekend grocery run that had turned into one of those long, lazy detours through neighborhoods we didn't belong in. The kind where the lawns looked like they were trimmed with nail scissors and the mailboxes matched the shutters, where everything smelled faintly of fresh mulch and old money, and where my mother, perched in the passenger seat with a coffee she never drank, would sigh every few blocks and murmur things like, now that is a house you'd never have to apologize for. It was always the same one that made her voice dip low with longing, the big white colonial with the curved stone path and the symmetrical windows, with ivy crawling gently up one side, and that impossible wraparound porch that seemed to embrace the house like a secret. She called it my dream house, as if the word dream somehow excused the ache in her voice, as if calling it. That gave her permission to never have it. For decades, that house existed as a symbol more than a structure, part aspiration, part punishment. It was where she imagined she would have hosted better holidays, entertained neighbors worth envying, kept her marriage from slowly dissolving into sharp silences and cold dinners. She used to point to it and say if we'd moved there, things would have been different. And when Dad died, and the buffer between her and her disappointments vanished, the fantasy calcified into something sharper, regret dressed up as ambition, as if she could still somehow climb toward it if the universe tilted just right. But the universe never tilted in her favor, not like that. She kept her little two-story ranch with the dated shutters and the beige carpeting, clinging to the illusion of stability while quietly blaming her circumstances for every dream she shelved. Meanwhile, I grew up and learned never to want too much, because wanting made her uncomfortable. My goals were always too far, too expensive, or too much like something Jessica would do, even when they had nothing to do with Jessica at all. So I stopped dreaming out loud. And I certainly never told her when, years later, I started watching the listings on Crestwood Lane the way she once watched her soap operas, religiously, hopelessly, obsessively. The purchase itself was nothing flashy, though it felt like a heist. I made sure the LLC was clean, made sure the real estate agent didn't know my last name, and made absolutely certain the closing date would fall after Mom's birthday, but before Thanksgiving. I wasn't just buying a house. I was building a stage. Every decision had a motive. The clawfoot tub in the master bath was identical to the one she'd circled in a catalog in the early 90s. The wainscoting in the dining room was custom-milled to match a photo she'd once kept in a folder labeled Someday. The front porch swing? I tracked it down from a salvage yard because it looked like the one from her favorite childhood memory, a story she'd told 100 times, never realizing I was the only one listening. I spared no expense. Not because I needed the extravagance, but because I wanted the reaction. This wasn't about gloating. It wasn't about revenge, not exactly. It was about creating the one thing she always wanted and placing it just far enough out of reach that she'd feel it in her bones. When the renovations were complete, I called in a favor from a friend who worked in staging and open houses. We set the date. I made sure the flyers were discreet but tempting. I didn't want strangers. I wanted people who looked like they belonged in a place like that. And most importantly, I invited Mom. I told her the open house was for a client of mine, an executive relocating from Chicago who needed help flipping the place fast. I told her I thought she'd enjoy seeing it, that it had the kind of charm you like, and I played it so straight, so casually, that she didn't even suspect. Jessica had a school fundraiser that weekend, so she couldn't come. It was just me and Mom, like it hadn't been in years, walking through a house that she didn't know had been built for her and against her at the same time. She walked slowly, her fingers trailing along the walls as if memorizing texture. She paused in every room. She smiled with something I hadn't seen in years, real, unguarded joy. In the kitchen, she ran her hand across the quartz island and said, This is what a home should feel like." In the upstairs hallway, she stopped in front of a painting I'd hung, a vintage watercolor of magnolia blossoms, just like the one that used to hang in her mother's dining room. She looked at me and said, "Rachel, I wish I'd had a place like this when you girls were young. Maybe I would have been happier. Maybe I would have been better." That one nearly broke me. But I smiled and said nothing. We sat on the porch swing as the afternoon sun slid behind the trees. She seemed lighter, warmer, more like the version of her that used to exist before bitterness became a second skin. I almost felt guilty. Almost. But then she turned to me and said, "I hope your client appreciates what they've got. Some people don't know how lucky they are." And that was the moment. The moment I stopped pretending. I turned toward her, looked her in the eyes, and said, "There is no client, Mom. I bought this house. It's mine." Her face didn't change immediately. It took a few seconds for her brain to process what I'd said, and even then, she clung to disbelief like it was the last rung of a ladder she was sliding off of. "You? What? For yourself?" she asked, her voice thin and tight. "Yes," I said, calmly, steadily. "I bought it for myself. I've been renovating it for the last few months. Every inch, every decision, every detail. For me." She stared at me, and I could see the calculations flickering behind her eyes, the questions she wouldn't ask, the assumptions she wanted to cling to, the certainty that this had to be some kind of mistake. And then I delivered the last line, the one that had been sitting in my chest like a stone for weeks. "You won't need a guest room here. You're not staying." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. I just said it, and then stood up and walked inside, leaving her sitting on that perfect porch swing, staring out at the perfect lawn, surrounded by the perfect house she'd always wanted but never believed I could build. And I didn't look back. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't know her that. The thing about people like Jessica is that they never actually expect to be challenged, not because they're inherently cruel or calculating, though sometimes they are, but because they've spent so much of their lives being protected by soft landings and benefit of the doubt indulgences that it doesn't occur to them that consequences might, one day, knock on their door wearing heels and a fitted blazer. I didn't hear from her right away after the birthday dinner. In fact, it was nearly a full week before she called, which in Jessica time is a lifetime. Especially considering how dramatic the fallout was from Mom's announcement and my not-so-subtle revenge toast that shut the entire table down like a power outage. I knew she'd stew. I knew she'd try to play it cool, wait for the right moment to strike, and when her name finally lit up my phone, I almost didn't answer, not out of fear, but out of a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing that whatever script she'd written for herself this time, I wasn't going to follow it. Still, curiosity won out, and when I picked up, I could hear the tightness in her voice before she even said a word beyond hello. There was a pause, the kind laced with performative restraint, and then she launched in, not with a question or an attempt to understand, but with a single, cutting statement meant to set the tone. Do you have any idea what you did to her? The phrasing was deliberate, as if my choices were an act of violence and not, in fact, a long overdue boundary. I leaned back in my chair, stared at the vaulted ceiling of the Crestwood house, and responded with a measured calm I knew would needle her more than any raised voice ever could. She made her choices, Jess. I made mine. That opened the floodgates. She went off like a shaken soda can, not yelling, but speaking in that clipped, breathless way she always does when she's trying to sound righteous, accusing me of humiliating Mom in front of the family, of being cold and vindictive, of making everything about myself instead of just letting her have her moment. I wanted to laugh. As if watching your mother publicly erase you from the family legacy in favor of your sister is something a person should just sit through with a polite nod and maybe a round of applause. But I didn't laugh. I let her finish. I let her spill every ounce of indignation she'd built up in those 7 long days of silence, and when she finally paused for breath, I said, "You want to know what I did to her?" I gave her a taste of what it feels like to be invisible. Just for one day. Jessica didn't take that well. She accused me of being jealous, which was rich considering that she was the one calling me, not the other way around. She talked about how Mom had been so excited to give her the house, how it had meant the world to her to feel appreciated, and how my little stunt had ruined everything. I stayed quiet through most of it, but when she said, "You could have just let her have this," something in me snapped, not into rage, not into tears, but into something sharper, older. Something forged from all the birthdays where I bought my own cake and the milestones no one showed up for and the times Mom called to ask about Jessica's kids, but never once asked how I was sleeping after my divorce. I let her have everything, Jessica, I said, my voice low but steady, the kind of voice that doesn't need volume to cut through bone. I let her have the best of Dad. I let her have the benefit of the doubt. I let her shape the story of this family like I was just a footnote. And you? You let her. Because it was easy. Because it worked in your favor. That's when she got personal. She accused me of being bitter, of being lonely, of resenting her for having a family, as if my life was some tragic shadow of hers and not, in fact, something I'd built deliberately, independently, with a resilience she couldn't fathom because she'd never had to develop it. Then, like she was lobbing a grenade, she dropped her big twist. Mom changed the will again. Last week. Everything's still coming to me. The lawyer was at the house. She signed it right before her birthday. For a moment, I said nothing. Not because I was shocked. I'd long suspected that any change would be performative at best and irrevocably biased at worst, but because I needed to let her think she'd won something. I needed her to have that 5 seconds of smug triumph, that misplaced glee, because what came next was going to dismantle her in ways a revised will never could. That's fine, I said, and I could hear her confusion blooming like static on the other end of the line. You might want to check Mom's bank account, though. There was a pause, a breath, and I could practically see her brow furrow. Why? She asked, hesitant now. Because she doesn't know yet, I said, but the account your inheritance is tied to? It's mostly gone. That house on Crestwood? I didn't pay for it with a mortgage. Jessica fell completely silent. I let it sit there, the truth of it, the weight. Because what I hadn't told anyone, not even Darlene, was that I'd used the money Dad had left me, the money Mom never knew about, the quiet portion of his estate that he'd funneled into a trust only I could access, perhaps because on some level, he understood even then what was coming. I'd never touched it until now. I never needed to. But this had felt like the right moment to make use of what he'd tried to leave me, an invisible balance to the invisible burdens I'd carried all my life. Jessica sputtered. She tried to recover, tried to turn the conversation back around, but her footing was gone, and we both knew it. "You're trying to punish her," she said. "You're trying to punish all of us." "No," I replied, and this time I did smile, though she couldn't see it. "I'm trying to show her that consequences don't just happen to other people." When the call ended, I stared out the window of the Crestwood kitchen, the one with the ocean-colored tile she'd always wanted, and I thought about the way Mom's hands had trembled when she touched the doorframe, how her voice had softened in that house like it hadn't in years. And I wondered, not for the first time, if she would ever understand that I hadn't done all this to take something from her, but to finally stop letting her take from me. But even I didn't know then how far it would go. Because the final move hadn't been played yet. And when it was, it wouldn't just shift the story. It would rewrite the ending completely. There's a peculiar kind of silence that follows the collapse of an illusion, not the immediate kind that comes with slamming doors or dramatic exits, but the quiet that settles days later when everyone has run out of accusations, explanations, and excuses, a silence so thick it feels like it muffles the very air in the room, a silence I had grown accustomed to in the aftermath of that phone call with Jessica, when her voice, normally so self-assured and carefully modulated, had cracked ever so slightly beneath the weight of truths she didn't expect to hear and couldn't unlearn. I didn't reach out after that, and neither did she, which suited me just fine, because by then, the arc of this entire unraveling had reached the point where words were no longer the currency we were dealing in. What was left was action, consequence, and the uncomfortable understanding that what had once been stable ground between us was now split by a fissure no holiday or half-hearted apology could bridge. Mom, to her credit or maybe to her eternal discredit, didn't call me either. Whether out of pride, shock, or some self-imposed narrative in which she was now the victim of some vindictive campaign of vengeance, she went dark. Not a thank you for the open house tour, not a question about the Crestwood purchase, not even a passive-aggressive text about how some people forget their roots. Nothing. And, while part of me wondered how she was spinning this silence to Jessica, because I had no doubt she was, another part of me, the deeper, older part that had carried this fractured mother-daughter bond like a limp limb for 4 decades, understood that this silence was her final attempt to retain control by withholding what she had always used to manipulate, attention. But the thing is, by then I no longer needed her attention to feel real. I didn't need her approval to validate my choices or her praise to inflate my sense of worth. The Crestwood house, for all its symbolism and revenge-laced details, had become less a monument to spite and more a sanctuary from the expectations that had suffocated me for most of my life. And it was within those freshly painted walls and beneath those hand-picked fixtures that a new thought began to take root, not a petty idea, not a retaliatory impulse, but a deliberate, powerful decision that would cut deeper than any toast at a birthday dinner ever could. It began with a letter, a simple white envelope addressed not to my mother, not to Jessica, but to a small nonprofit organization just outside of town that operated transitional housing for women escaping domestic abuse and familial estrangement. I had read about them months earlier while researching staging companies, and something about their mission stuck with me, not in a way that immediately screamed destiny or poetic justice, but in the quiet, persistent way that ideas sometimes circle until they find an opening. These women, most of them young, most of them alone, had been cast out or broken down by the people who were supposed to protect them. They had survived what many couldn't, and they were rebuilding from scratch. That I understood. I didn't tell anyone when I met with the director. I didn't tell my friends, didn't post about it, didn't document the tour of the facility or the quiet tears that welled in the woman's eyes when I told her what I wanted to do. The idea was simple: transfer ownership of the Crestwood property free and clear, fully furnished, utilities connected, maintenance prepaid for 3 years, to the organization for use as a long-term transitional home. No fanfare. No naming rights. No plaque on the door. Just a house, warm and safe, and filled with the kind of details that made it feel like someone had once loved the space enough to make it beautiful. When the documents were finalized, I drove to the house one last time, walked through every room slowly, running my fingers along the banisters, opening every drawer, not out of sentimentality, but to make sure everything was intact, placed, complete. I paused in the kitchen, stared out the window into the backyard, and thought about how many nights my mother must have sat at our old kitchen table, staring into her lukewarm tea and thinking about this very house, building a fantasy around it where everything that had gone wrong in her life could be rewritten. And in that moment, I felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction, only clarity. The final toast came 2 nights later at a small dinner I hosted at a local restaurant. Not a grand affair, not a declaration of victory, just a quiet gathering of people who mattered, people who had seen me through the long process of claiming my voice, people who had known me before I was just the other daughter. I raised a glass, not of champagne, but of a bold red I'd been saving for the right moment, and I said only this: to the daughters who were never chosen, to the women who learned to build what no one would give them, and to the homes we make, not just the ones we buy. They clinked their glasses, and no one asked what I meant, because the right people already knew. It was days later when Jessica found out, though I wasn't there to see it and didn't ask how it unfolded. I only knew that a mutual friend had passed along the information and that Mom, upon hearing it, reportedly locked herself in her bedroom for the rest of the day. Whether that was from grief, shame, or some toxic cocktail of the two, I'll never know, because she still hasn't spoken to me. She probably never will. And strangely, I'm okay with that. Because the truth is, this was never about the house. It was never about the money or the will or even about Jessica. Not really. This was about ending the story I'd been forced to live inside, the one where I was always second best, always the outsider, always holding my breath for someone else's permission to matter. I didn't get my mother's love, not the way I wanted, and maybe not at all. But I got something better. I got to choose how the story ends. And in my ending, no one is begging to be seen, no one is punished into silence, and no one has to sit at a table wondering why they're never enough. Some endings don't come with applause. Some don't even come with peace. But they come with truth. And sometimes, that's the most satisfying kind of revenge there is.